Ah, my dear Tyler. Good old Tyler. How are you, Tyler? You doing okay?
Hey, doing great. Look what I got here.
Oh, what do you got? Oh my goodness, I'm gonna blush. Oh my god. Well, that's very kind. Thank you for picking it up, Tyler. Goodness.
Yeah, yep. So this morning I was just flipping through it a little bit. Looking forward to spending more time with it.
Well, thank you, sir. I hope you enjoy it. I hope it has good thoughts in it and different things like that. So thank you for picking it up. Well, what have you been thinking about recently, Tyler? What's been going through your mind?
Ooh, well, so I think I mentioned in the email to you that so I got to interview Richard Boothby
Wow.
2 days ago, and so I was just swimming in his work for the last 3 weeks. Uh, yeah, and I just felt like his work was speaking right to uh, his work on putting anxiety and rooting anxiety in the primary caregiver, the
Mm,
relation to the primary caregiver, and the unknown enigmatic desire, and how that relates. That's essentially what he refers to as does ding, or the thing, that
mm,
unknowable zone of the other that remains impenetrable, that Lacan roots that as the source of anxiety, and then how we always flee from that, um, through different symbolic and imaginary identities, and how that then creates all these tendencies for new forms of tribalism, I would say.
mm,
and
mm,
that and that just was in a very satisfying way answering some these awkward situations that I kept finding myself in, where it feels as though I'm being asked to unhesitatingly proclaim, you know, my position on a political or religious question. And
mm.
so his work, I felt like in a very satisfying way, answered, or, spoke to that, those awkward situations and I emailed you about some of those awkward situations, and we were at some point. I do hope that we get to talk more about that too.
We will. There is no doubt about that. And Javier Rivera, it is good to see you. No, I think the Dusty and Javier Rivera's been freaking interviewing the father of internet philosophy, Sadler, and then the talk with Cheetah I just finished was really,
Oh,
really good. So Javier has been having some tremendous conversations. And actually the dusting is very interesting because I know, and I'd be curious to hear more on Mr. Boothie's thinking on that. So I look forward to your conversation because, where the Das Ding is kind of the sacred, kind of the zone of the sacred that we encounter. What's very interesting is I wonder if, there's something about this fighting against the experience of lack where we want to know where the other person is. Are you Christian or not? Confess Jesus. Where we're trying to actually, in a funny way, remove the potential of them sacredly encountering us. Like, this is the funny thing. Like, if Boothby is correct, which I think he's getting at a lot, the very desire to kind of designate someone by a clear religious identity actually gets in the way of a religious experience because you are categorizing them. And then it's also interesting because, in a sense, if we're thinking about lack, you're trying to take away the lack of the other person. Like you're lacking a clear structure of them. Are they Christian or not? Well, let me remove it. Okay, they're not lacking anymore. I know they are Christian. And that would actually locate the experience of lack and anxiety with the experience of the Das Ding. And then what's funny is, based on the talk that Javier was having with Chiton on this kind of idea of, is that exactly how you slow down entropy according to negentropy? And I really appreciate what Chiton was saying about all that. Mr. Thomas Jockin, good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well. And so that idea of actually the willing to kind of let the Das Ding wash over you, to let the lack wash over you. I was Mr. Jockin, I was speaking a bit. Tyler here recently interviewed Richard Boothby, who does fascinating work as a Lacan scholar and kind of thinking lack and dusting in terms of religion, and how dusting is this concept that comes up in Lacan, but then he kind of drops it, and how Boothby kind of notes how Lacan is like, this is it, and then kind of lets it go. I know in the conference, in the class at Philosophy Porter, Boothby thought that it might have something to do with Lacan trying to distance himself from something that seemed Heideggerian, being coming forth. He's like, yeah, I don't want to talk about that. That sounds a little Heideggerian, and Heidegger doesn't have a really good reputation right now, so I'm going to get away from that. But how this kind of idea of the dusting being precisely what temples and rituals are often kind of playing with. And what's interesting is the similarities between lack, dusting, the real, these all things seem to overlap, but also be different. Where the dusting is this kind of radical something that is always beyond the symbolizable. It cannot be brought into the symbolic. It cannot be brought into the imaginary. And funny enough, if that could be on kind of this experience of just wanting, like we've talked about a lot, where now in, say, Christianity, there's almost this kind of McCarthyism of confess Jesus or not. Are you a Christian or not? I'm sorry. Where it becomes kind of a currency, a kind of tokenization, where how that actually, in the idea of getting a religious designation, may actually block the dusting for the religious experience in this sense, right? Which then, listening to Chiton, that actually, funny enough, the willingness to be kind of washed over by the anxiety of dusting is exactly how we seem to be better at slowing down entropy, or according to negentropy, and different things, when you would think it'd be the exact opposite, right? And then, of course, the questions that come into mind, and then I'll pass it to Javier. Does this transcend use and useless considerations because you can never systemize it? Does this transcend the language of habits? Is this something that we can think about in terms of beauty and a science of beauty? I think the dusting with Richard Boothie is very interesting. But Javier, I'll pass it to you. And then I'd also be curious on additional thoughts you have from your recent two conversations and what you've been exploring. Because again, you interviewed the father of like internet YouTube philosophy, George Sadler. So, I remember he got me on Blondel like 10 years ago. So I really appreciate that. But Javier, how are you today, sir?
I'm good. I'm good. I mean, I've been talking to Jockin a lot, so happy to see him here. I've also been talking to Luber a lot too. Yeah. Well, one, I'll address the Greg Sadler question. Yeah, I mean, I love talking to him. You can tell he's a guy that kind of been through the ringer on philosophy, and there's actually a funny scene where I'm like, yeah, philosophy is all about failure, right? And he's like, yeah, but if it was, that wouldn't really be interesting, would it? He totally gets me on that one.
He let you
But
experience that failure, didn't he? He's like, nah, he's like, oh, wait, maybe it is failure. I feel really philosophical right now. Anyway.
yeah, well, I mean, it was really good talking to him though. Talking to Chaitan though, that really that left me with a lot of thoughts. And I'll be talking to Espacea too. Um, she she has some thoughts on my talk with Chaitan that I guess is going to get challenged and elaborated on. uh, yeah. So when you talk about can we transcend habits, it seems to be the promise of that non-relation, possibly, right? The fact that Chaitan was telling me that the non-relation is not only the it's a side of creativity as well, right? So maybe we can. I really like Chaitan's point on how uselessness can suddenly become useful. Like there's a real funny contradiction with uselessness and usefulness where we can use uselessness and it becomes this funny contradiction. And so I think to be honest, Daniel, I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. It seems like repetition is a very big deal in this conversation because I was listening to the talk that you and Ebert were having, and he kind of made the point about the Plato's cave. He's like, well, I don't think there's anything you have to do about it. It's more about that you have to let it exhaust itself, and then people get bored, and then people be like, yeah, maybe I will leave the cave. It's interesting that that could happen. But I did think that actually Espacea was challenging my talk with Teitan about that it's not always about just letting the repetition exhaust itself. So that's gonna be that's a I was just like I was like that's interesting. Let's talk about it because I guess we're gonna talk about it today. But one final note is, I wonder if Boothby's Das Ding is very similar to Eliade's notion of the sacred. I think that's really interesting because it means that the sacred is always present in some ways. Eliade makes this point, the fact that you desire meaning, the fact that you desire, you enjoy books and then watch movies. I mean, he's basically saying this is all connected to the fact that you want some relation to the sacred. But what's interesting is that even though we desire some relation to the sacred, we don't desire it in the way that we would want to, right? This idea of trying to close the gap, trying to maintain our subjective bubbles by giving an attribute to another being, meaning, are you Christian or are you not Christian? That allows me to navigate my own subjective bubble very easily and very well. I can remain in my subjective bubble as long as I know what you are, right? That kind of allows me to play that move. And I think Buber is helpful in breaking this because you can't. The moment you talk about an attribute or a quality of a person, you are reducing them to a thing and not a being. So that means an actual being is more anxiety than a thing, than an object, just because you can designate it as such. At least this is what Buber would say. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Marvelous. And again, I really enjoyed both your Chiton talk, and Aspasia is awesome. I really like Aspasia, and your talk with the great Dr. Sadler was wonderful. I'll pass it to Jockin. Mr. Ebert, it's good to see you, sir. I greatly enjoyed our last conversation. Philip, Shinn, Michelle, good to see all of you. And no, it's very interesting. So a few things, like I was thinking, actually, after listening to your talk with Chiton, I was kind of reflecting on myself on kind of this idea. Oh, a Christian, it's good to see you, sir. And on this kind of idea of what do I do? Do I think in terms of use and useless? Do I think in terms of optimization? And I often actually just go through my day really trying, I almost don't think in those terms. Like I almost am like, how do I engage in kind of self-forgetfulness? The moment I ask, is this useful or not? I feel like I've already messed up, actually, right? Because really, like, so for example, my beloved 1990 Oldsmobile is not starting right now. It makes me really sad because this car is 34 years old and it's the best car ever. But so now I find myself saying, how do I solve the problem? And now I'm entering into a kind of what would be useful for the problem or not. But that mode doesn't emerge until the surprise of the problem, right? Like useful or useless seems to kind of emerge when you encounter a certain surprise, right? But then it seems like you're supposed to kind of fall out of that once you figure out what you're supposed to do with the Oldsmobile, and really more so for me, engage into a self-forgetfulness. And to me, I guess I think about that, one, in like, am I doing the things like in the way that makes me more open to reality? Like, it's a very interesting question. Like, if you don't, what does a day look like when you're not living according to what is useful, what is productive or not? And it seems to have some sort of more, am I conditioning in a manner to kind of receive life? Or open to life, like the term I think about is beauty, right? Like in that kind of the way that Jockin will talk about on this sort of openness to the surprise and pull of reality, right? And that's interesting because that's almost, because it comes to this topic of boredom, which Chiton was making very important points on. Without boredom, you can never think outside the flow of productivity and optimization. He made that also very important distinction with action in the Hannah Arendt set, where the public is the realm of action, right? And that, when I think about it, it's like you're supposed to kind of be living in your life where you're mostly in the realm of action, where you're acting in the world according to conditioning yourself, according to, dare I say, the true, the beautiful, and the good, which seem to have something to do with your ability to encounter the dusting and not be overwhelmed by the anxiety. And that also, too, where this is very interesting, because like what Eva was saying in Plato's cave, you would get bored and leave. Again, on the Patricia Sachs book, I personally, just based on that, make a distinction between boredom and daydreaming. For her, boredom is the existential feeling of I have nothing to do, and it's a dread. And it's more like you're paralyzed, like the centipede. Whereas daydreaming, which seems to be the necessary condition of action and staying in the public and the human, is where your thinking is able to almost float into going, hey, maybe this is a cave and I could leave. Because the problem following Patricia Sachs' definition of boredom, if you were in Plato's cave and you got bored, it wouldn't occur to you you were in a cave. You'd be paralyzed and terrible, and you'd be reflecting on yourself as having nothing to do, right? The thought would not occur to you that you're in a cave. Whereas if you're daydreaming, then you could go, maybe I could leave this cave. Maybe there are other possibilities, but then you would have to incubate the conditions of the possibility of daydreaming, right? And here's the critical point that's so interesting, and this would really have to be elaborated on. Boredom, as distinct from daydreaming, doesn't come into existence in literature like a Flaubert or a Montaigne or all these people until the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution and capital. Then a fascinating distinction arises between boredom and daydreaming as an existential event for the subject, where boredom has something to do with the regime of utility, productivity, and the economic man, whereas daydreaming seems to be in the realm of action. And I do think, actually, as a human being, you're supposed to kind of live in a manner to be more daydreaming in a sense. Like, even as you're going through the day, cutting the grass, your mind is kind of wandering. It's in a state of wonder, really. And I think Mr. Ebert is correct to note that that seems to be a state by which one can leave the cave in the same way that encountering limit seems to be the case. But it's interesting today, and then I'll pass it to Mr. Jockin, Philip, Michelle, and then Javier. It's interesting to think that today it's actually more difficult for the experience of boredom. It could be, following Patricia Sachs and some of the other literary, it could be more difficult today to experience boredom as daydreaming under the logic of capital, is the argument, which is bizarre. But that seems to be because you actually have different emotional experiences arise given different socioeconomic conditions. Like, they're talking now, I don't know if it's true or not, they're talking now about kids who are younger by 2 decades than me, which is great, having emotions that they don't even have words for now, right? So that's quite interesting to think. But let me pass it to Jockin, Philip, Michelle, and Javier. Mr. Jockin, it is good to see you, sir.
Always good to see everybody. Javier, long time no see. We're talking quite a bit online recently. You know what's funny? Because like this, discussion of use and uselessness. I think, Daniel, you talked about it's been a while, but the ideal scenario of entrepreneurship is to actually address this point, in the sense of one mode of creativity is the idea that things may seem useless actually can be made useful by different accounts, and this is an act of creativity, right? So basically, kind of spark out of basically things that are out of one interpretation of one lens, completely not useful, of utility, of any purpose, become useful. So that point is they didn't come out of nowhere. It was the entrepreneur, the one with the creativity, that generated that out. I'm just thinking about that because I kind of like, if Dall's thing, if I understand correctly, is the object of desire, right? And one of the things entrepreneurs are very sensitive about. Now, it's been made into a caricature since Y Combinator and whatnot, but they are absolutely artisans of desire. They are very aware of desire, and their whole process is to generate basic value, right, through the operations, generate more interactions of desire, being satiated in different modes in different ways. Now, which objects of desire are being mediated by what ways? Worth the discussion, but that's what they're doing, and they're using usually channels of optimization to do that. They're generally trying to play a game of bringing objects and markets together, right? That allow, through their combination, allow generation of a new accentuation of desire, satiation of desire, attempted anyway, and that surplus value gets captured as revenue, right, or detention, or some other variable like that. I find that very interesting, because in terms of like what is exactly the operation of an entrepreneur and what they're trying to do, and if the caricature, the Y Combinator caricature, is the only way it would play out, does it have to be that way? I'm just kind of chewing on that as one point. The other one is this idea of boredom and daydreaming. I always think of like a lot of traditions state that most of the populace are daydreaming. We're dreaming. We're actually not engaging with reality. So I find it very interesting Daniel made that comment. Very interesting. I think the idea is root, right? It's like kind of fundamentally there's an idea of like object constancy, that A is A through time, that things remain the same over time. There's a kind of interesting logic built into that, no? I'm just thinking about that in a sense of like, it seems that in boredom especially, there seems to be a response that there's a meaninglessness of this temporal experience. I think Daniel brought that up many times before. And there's a kind of pain that results in that, right? There's kind of an exact kind of experiential pain of that duration, experience that duration of existence. Daydreaming seems to be one way to get around that, right? It almost, in terms of it, tends to be a kind of, usually daydreams are a kind of way to escape the circumstances that one finds someone in. It's kind of chewing on these points. I do wonder if there's a, kind of a way to connect these 2 points I just brought up, this idea of interaction of the kind of generation of value through operations of desire, and how that's mediated through different technologies or platforms. Because also entrepreneurial tends to be attached to digital technologies too, as well. We tend to use it. Though doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I'm just thinking about that. I just bring this up to point out, like, maybe the best exemplar of this would be like Tinder, of a way of basically literally pressing on the reproduction desire operation and using a channel platform on that. It almost seems like that's the perfect exemplar of that, of these kind of one direction of operation, of optimization, of satiation of desire. Is that necessarily the only way? I wonder about that. Basically, I'm just bringing it up as a question. That's all I got.
No, it's magnificent. And I'm not sure how to word it yet, but just, there seems to be something following the 19th century where boredom, as defined by patricide, and everyone uses words differently, so this is no claim that this word must mean this forever and so forth, is that it seems to be a philosophical emotion. It requires the call planier unembeddedness from common life. It requires some sort of pulling out, where you are finding yourself unable to be situated and you're flooded with possibility, but unable to choose the significance of any of those possibilities. Boredom is not a state where you have nothing to do. It's where you can't determine it's where nothing that you could do has significance, or you don't have a standard of value by which to break the birdie and donkey tie, if you will. And it's a kind of a philosophical thing. Now, there is also thoughtlessness, which seems to be the kind of, most people are going through that kind of thoughtlessness, right? Which you could associate with the word daydreaming. But it's interesting because if I were to just language it, and this doesn't have to be authoritative, it's almost like you have thoughtlessness, then you have, because of a philosophical unembeddedness or capital whatever, you get boredom. But then there seems to be, if I'm using this return to common life or Hegelian return with the RE in parentheses, you could say daydreaming is the negation sublation of these things together. Maybe there's a better word, I'm not sure. And the reason I say that is because if I think about the way my own mental processes work, which look like coffee, but if I think about it, there is this kind of, you're filling yourself with books, you're having experience, and then there's something arising in you that feels very unintentional. Like you're saying, like I agree, there was this kind of in Silicon Valley, how do we be unintentional about happenstance? How do we be unintentional about how do we optimize the suboptimal so we're the most creative, right? And it would be interesting, I know, from all I can tell, I'm not sure if this, to kind of Javier's point, with Chetan, I'm not sure if this experiment has ultimately proven to yield the creation of wealth that one would expect. So there might be a short circuiting that would occur. Yeah, you can talk about AI, but it seems very concentrated within, say, a NVIDIA or these particular companies. I'm not sure. I do know the amount of unicorn investments have dropped like a rock. You could say that's just because interest rates being high, but it's an entirely different conversation. So it would be an interesting case study. I don't know the answer at this moment on if this effort to optimize the suboptimal or the happenstance for gaming creativity has yielded the fruit. It certainly has not yielded the fruit of the great enrichment of, say, a Dietrich McCloskey, but this would have to be elaborated on, suggesting that you can't gamify you can't gamify the happenstance, no matter how much you try, or you can't, it's much more surprising than we even realize. Or maybe it's also like, maybe the bathroom trick works. You know how in Google they had the architecture and the engineering bathrooms, they all met, so they had the happenstance interactions, right? Maybe that works until somebody writes a book about it, and then you know it's planned. I wonder that as well. Like if the happenstance works until people know that it's intentional, and there's something then that makes it feel fake. Like, and that would be interesting because it would suggest the virtual has an impact on the role of the experience of the coincidence. Right? I'm not sure, but I think about that. But anyway, I'll pass it to Philip, Michelle, and Javier. I do wonder, like, if there's some kind of negation sublation of thoughtless and boredom that gets into this daydreaming where your mind it's as if your mind is orbiting more so. It's looking for the beautiful. It's looking for the dusting. It's searching for these things, gathering a certain subjectivity that has a wandering structure to it, but it's not a randomness. This is what I find very interesting. Like there's a kind of wandering for experiences or something that can come forth, but it's not, but it is outside the realm of market, like Chitan was saying. It's in the realm of action. Ergo, it has this quality of boredom, but not the same existential freezing of boredom. And again, it's curious when you look at, say, the plays of Keats, moving to Samuel Beckett, the everyday plays, you see these, literature can be a very useful case study for developments of new emotions, new views of subjectivity, precisely in the same way that entrepreneurship was good when it happened to be creative. Literature is not trying to be philosophical and therefore can provide some of the best philosophical maps. Because in just trying to describe how reality is, it unintentionally provides philosophical material incidentally. And that it's funny. And that's why I think literature can be, but more can be said. Let me give it to Philip. Mr. Philip Shinn, how are you, sir?
Good to see you and everyone. I wonder how much with this boredom question is like whether or not the language script you're going through is from the overlords or the overmind, which is to say, like, are you stuck in the superego, or have you transcended it and gotten to some kind of absolute knowing? How you tell the difference, good luck. But it does seem like a lot of the optimization is focused on information. Do this, do this, do this, do this. I'm reading Byung-Chul Han's The Crisis of Narration right now. So Daydreaming feels like it gets a more narrative structure going on. You tap a little bit more into the narrative. And I wonder if the logic of capital prioritizes information over narrative. And when we're thinking use or useless, is it from this lens of information rather than a story, which would be more like living and acting, you know? And it's like really hard to be in the moment and tell a story. There's like a necessary distance that he talks about, which requires memory, which requires attention. And I know I'm still a neophyte on the net, you know, number 197 today. I probably haven't done 10%, but I've never heard Proust mentioned. My God, we talk about story all the time. And this guy, you know, he was the one who kind of like talked about the past, remembering, and how kind of happiness lies in almost in a weird way being like, I can recognize it only when I realize I was once happy. And then you kind of like have to live a bunch more and you're like, whoa, what's going on? And then you're like, oh, I was actually happy then too. And it's really hard to project it into the future to be like, well, if I do this, this, and this, then I'll be happy. And I wonder how much of that has to do. Here's another name I haven't heard, Boethius. How much of that has to do with when he writes in the Constellations of Philosophy, what we're dealing with Lady Fortune and Lady Philosophy. Like if Lady Fortune in a way is connected to dusting, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh. I mean, it could be something really, really good or really, really bad. And then Lady Philosophy comes around and tries to console him with making sense. And to Jockin's point, I wonder, and what you were saying, Daniel, about McCloskey, how would we even measure whether or not an entrepreneur is focused on enrichment or enjoyment? And by enjoyment, I mean specifically MCM Prime, right? So like Tinder, okay. There may be, there's probably an argument there that's like, there's been some good stuff that's come out of this. Like some people have gone on to it and wouldn't have met had it not been for that, and it led to an enriching life. I would guess that's a minority, a small minority. For the most part, it seems to be a tool of capital. that has created sort of a certain branch of the phono sapient, wherein like time is speeding up when we're assessing beauty. It's a swipe right, swipe left. And I wonder how much of that we have like any say over anymore, you know, because like the game theoretic dynamics, as soon as that stuff's unleashed in the market, it, of course, every single advertisement is going to say this is enriching. Like this is the great enrichment. This is the best thing since sliced bread, and all the chicks will like you if you get this. You know, and I wonder how you think. I mean, how anyone thinks of that tension between, you know, enrichment and enjoyment as far as the digital sphere goes.
No, it's a magnificent comment. Mr. Luber, it's good to see you. And Sam Willem, it's good to see you. I'll pass it to Marcel and Javier, I think. And Mr. Ebert had a wonderful comment where he's pointing that there is certainly the artisan goods, the booms, there's this kind of, oh, yes, this is suboptimal. It's not at a store. And that becomes a marketing thing. So it's very true that you absolutely can create systems that try to optimize the happenstance or the creativity or stuff like that. The question that is always interesting to me, which I don't know the answer to, is the contingency of that working, the fact that people don't realize that people are using the happenstance or the fact that it's a farmer's good for their advantage. Like once people become conscious, they're like, wait a minute. And then you have to like innovate a new suboptimal thing. And that's kind of funny because then it becomes, I wonder if you get like a suboptimal arms race. Like where people are like, nah, I'm not going to do this freaking farmer's market. They're just playing that on me. It's like, I'm going to go straight to the garden market. So you go to the garden and the market, and then you go to the seed market, and then you're out there growing it yourself. And you're paying someone to grow the seeds yourself and to harvest everything. And it's like a new market. That's really funny. And I laugh. But I do know Mr. Ebert has said that one day people are going to pay to go somewhere where there's not internet. And I do think that's actually happening. So maybe everyone, this is, if at all, that will be our new entrepreneurial undertaking at the net. We're just going to open a cabin somewhere, no water, you grow your own food, no internet, everything, the ultimate optimal, and it will be like $500,000. It's going to be great. Yes, the future, only the rich will be able to afford nothing. That's lovely. And then that's funny because that line also does make me think about only the rich will be in Plato's cave. Is that what's going to happen? Like only the rich will actually be in Plato's cave. There's nothing there, which is precisely the environment that then incubates within them the daydreaming, as we're so describing. Only the rich will be able to be in a situation where they can think outside the economic in terms of action. Like G-Tom was saying, outside the flow of optimization, only the rich will be able to go to a place where they prove able to think thoughts that are already not captured by the system. So, and there's probably a lot of truth to that, which would be funny because for most of history, we associate the rich with the people in the market, in capital, completely captured by those sort of logics. What if you almost have a reversal where then it will actually be only the rich who are able to go into spaces where they can incubate thoughts in the realm of action and the social versus the market? That's an interesting thought experiment I'd have to think on. But before passing it to Javier, what you were saying on Proust, what I find very fascinating in remembrance of lost time, when you have this associational logic, the famous example, eating the cookie, he's in the past, and this whole sort of idea of this experience of time that is the past and the present and the future are all mixed together. The birth of the stream of consciousness of Joyce, Faulkner, Benjy, all of this. What's fascinating is you could say, yeah, it was a literary technique that just arose at the beginning of the 20th century, and I guess Proust 1880s or something. Anyway, well, yeah, but what's more interesting is to ask, what was the socioeconomic condition that made that literary technique seem like what was needed to describe reality? And what you see, because you don't really see that kind of narrative structure, or you see things like in Conrad, starting with The Secret Agent or Heart of Darkness, the movement of describing events from a particular point of view, and then moving between other characters like in The Secret Agent. But what's so interesting is the structure of literature increasingly moves the story to the subjectivity of the individual and plays with techniques based on that individuality. That right there, that seems to be the horizon necessary for the subject to experience things like boredom. which then makes possible the negation sublation of daydreaming, as I am so defining, but I'm all game for a different word, which then again suggests what exactly is happening there that moves the subject in that direction. Because if you can answer that question or kind of get at it, then you can start to go, oh, okay, almost like tasting fine wine. What is the difference between this daydreaming and boredom and thoughtlessness? Thoughtlessness, boredom, and daydreaming. Let's taste the wine. What's the difference? Because something has emerged in the 20th century that seems new. And then we can say, well, what were the economic conditions that changed? Because then we could identify those as perhaps what we want to be more, dare I say, intentional about, so that we don't incubate boredom instead of daydreaming or different things. So more can be said on that, but let me give it to Michelle and Javier. Michelle, please.
Yeah, I think this is all really interesting. And I was thinking about boredom and how it's really a good point what you say, Daniel, where it's this sort of, in a way, a kind of paralysis, because, when boredom comes up, it's, you'll also hear it paired with, there's nothing to do, I'm bored. What's there to do? Right. So it's like, there's nothing to do. False. You could run up and down the driveway 10 times. Like there's so many things you could do, like you're saying. You just don't want to do any of those things, right? Like you want to do something shiny, or you want somebody to give you something to do, right? Basically, well, maybe not so much, right? Because sometimes the parent will be like, "Oh, you're bored. You want something to do? Like here's, why don't you unpack the dishes?" Suddenly it's like, no, I don't want to do that, right? So it's not about. It's this interesting place of. I'm just trying to think about it very, very practically with like little children and children and what they say and how because what should you do, right? Like in a way, you don't want to vilify boredom because it's actually could be the potential space, but if you don't, I want to say you kind of just need to let it ride out. Let the kids be bored, let them figure it out, right? Now, if sometimes you get teens, I don't want to blame teens, okay? It can happen younger, it could happen older, but people do a lot of dumb stuff when they're bored just because they're bored, right? They're just looking for something to do, and they just get themselves in trouble because they're bored, right? So it's there needs to be a facilitation of, I don't know if it's just by exemplar or if it's just having the something I'll say, I don't know if it's good or bad, is just what's something you haven't done in a while? Maybe you could, but it's weird because the brain, I know how, or I can remember how it's almost like you forget everything you could be doing somehow. It's like when somebody says, "What's your favorite song?" You're like, "Song? What's a song?" That moment where you get asked, "What's your favorite song?" You can't even think of any song names at all, even though you've got a bunch of favorite songs. So I guess what I mean to say is there's a strange, I think that's why that was good, Daniel, with this kind of paralysis, and also why it may not fully address the question of leaving the cave, because it's kind of you just lay on the floor and you're like, there's nothing to do. It's not, you're not even moving usually, And so, but I guess I'm just thinking from the parental perspective, or just the external factor perspective of how to address that in a manner that allows it to become the place of, just maybe doing something. Doing something that's not destructive purely. Maybe it's some destructive and creative or something like this, but also to be able to just let it ride out, where you don't quickly try to squelch it. Oh, you're bored? Here's an iPad. Or, oh, you're bored? Here's this activity to do. You just let it. You can't, because if you constantly do that, I feel in a way you make it worse, right? Because then you never let the child or children or people's find out how they can solve that problem for themselves, actually. Even if they are going to be bored out of their minds for X amount of time, right? They'll be okay. You can't die from boredom. But you can start blowing stuff up from boredom too. So that can be a problem. But I do think the fear of that isn't the right direction, because, what you fear is what comes unto you. So you're going to possibly unintentionally cause more of that by being oh, we can't let anyone be bored, So I'm just thinking about the actual practical experience of this. And, I also am trying to think, typically I'm oh, I'm not somebody who gets bored, but I was thinking about how boredom might show up in other ways or something, just in a lack of motivation to do certain things, and how sometimes something that looks very industrious can actually be a form of boredom, because you're not, you'd rather be on that, if you think about what the word comes from, it's you're boring a hole into something. It's a slow, repetitious motion. And sometimes we rather just be in that known thing, right? Than do something that's different and kind of scary and have to make something now and it could be judged. I'm just thinking of some examples. So I was trying to be self-skeptical because I'm like, I typically don't, it's something that we probably all deal with in different ways. It doesn't always look like just the iconic being bored. But anyways, those are just a couple of thoughts that I wanted to share. Everyone's bringing up great stuff. And thanks again. I might have to start doing stuff in the kitchen, but I'll listen.
It's outstanding. And Mr. Ebert had another wonderful comment. I'll pass to Javier and then Chris. Well, what's very interesting, the reason why boredom, so there's a few questions. So there seems to be one possibility, if we use a freak theory model, where boredom eventually reaches an excess and transitions maybe into daydreaming, right? And that would be an example where boredom leads to maybe there's something beyond the cave and then you leave. Or it can be what's the point of even trying to leave, right? Like, so there's an interesting thing here. And the reason why the question of boredom is probably a really big question is because it seems to be actually linked to freedom in the sense of you stop seeing significance in, say, the rat race. And so then you think in the realm of the public and action. So boredom could be a liberation. But it also seems like there's a form of boredom that I just think about, like thinking about work. How many people came out of retirement when they were older precisely because they're like, I had nothing to do? And then that's funny because boredom in that way, kind of like how Karatani talks about the capital nation state, whereas the socialism turning to the government to stop the free market actually just helps the whole thing. Revolution is in service of the leader and, so on and so forth. There seems to be a form of boredom that then pulls people out of the realm of action, as Chitan was saying, back into the rat race of optimization and doing something and externally motivated. But then there's another form of boredom or having nothing to do that seems to be the artist or daydreaming or taking a walk or being able to be struck by the fullness of life or being able to think creatively. And the reason why this distinction seems incredibly important is because if there is something to the idea of AI changing employment or people having different jobs or there being more free time than ever before, then being really good at boredom or telling the difference or what you need to do to make people turn into creativity or something to daydream seems really, really important. And what Ebert is saying in the comment as well, where in the history where boredom, there's this boredom, but then you're guilty. I think you see that a lot in the first world nation. I have nothing to do, but I shouldn't be bored because I'm much better off than other people. And you start feeling bad and then everything blows up, right? So it's very interesting because then boredom get mixed with guilt that then perhaps leads people back into out of the realm of action and the public, back into the system, and it all feeds. So it would seem as if we have to get good at boredom in a sense, or get good at having nothing to do. Is it something where there's a difference between having nothing to do when surrounded by books, when having nothing to do when you have access to networks of people, versus bored and there isn't that environment? Maybe there's an environmental question where then boredom, like, can you put something in the cave that when people get bored of the cave, it increases the probability that they try to leave? Like, those are it seems like a very, very, very important question, but let me give it to Javier and then Christian. Javier Rivera.
I think the problem of boredom, in my opinion, is that why boredom is so complex for them is that boredom presupposes an ideal for them, an ideal that is actual, that should be achieved, as Ebert already pointed out. I think that's already the problem, really, because you could say capitalism captures us precisely because it can just repeat and push out a plethora of ideals, right? You can like now it's an ideal to go out in the desert and not have anything, right? Like that's I mean, one, it's amazing that it can do that, but it's the fact that we're captured by ideals. But the thing is, we're not looking at it as ideals. We're looking at it as actuality. The non-relation is really what is at the core to say that there is no ideal relationship to any of these things. You could say, I think boredom is what presupposes an ideal relationship. And that's why you could say it's frightening. But actually, to elaborate more on your daydreaming argument, I actually like the idea of wayfaring. But I'm going to stick with daydream right now because I think what it is, if we're going to stay with daydreaming as your thing, Daniel, I think what it is that we need to do the dream work. And I'm playing on Freud here in a very funny way, meaning like a part of the dream work is precisely why you get the dreams. right? But what I'm saying is, fuck the dreams, do the dream work. um, because I feel like it might be a little bit pointless to tell people, well, you shouldn't be captured by the manifest content. You should be looking at the latent content. But I mean, I still think there's something there. But my other concern is actually Ebert's notion of automaticity. And the reason why I'm concerned is because I feel like capitalism has sped up the speed of our automaticity, which allows for something like lack to be optimized actually relatively quickly. It's like just like that. And then so you could say this automaticity goes straight into like almost immediate forgetfulness. But yeah, I mean, I like the idea of dream work, because I think dream work actually, when Freud just, talks about dream work, it's like, yeah, it's what you do during the day. Why not take a walk, a stroll? And then those are the very elements that participate in your dreams. But to be captured by the manifest content, I think is what is happening here. And I think the daydreaming would require dream work to do a kind of process with that. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, the word wayfaring, that's pretty hot, though. I like that one, too. So, like I said, I'm looking for a term, and it is interesting to think dream work. I think there is absolutely something, and then I'll pass it to Christian and Mr. Luber, on this notion of what kind of work do you need to do so that this kind of daydreaming occurs that has some sort of structure of orbiting or open to glimmers or receiving. It is also interesting to wonder, is a relationship with lack or dusting in this kind of spiritual way that Boothby's saying, is that possible without daydreaming? Is that even possible without wayfaring, whatever term is? It would seem perhaps not, other than it would almost seem like, well, it would almost say, I'll just stick with daydreaming, language is fun. It would almost seem that without daydreaming, you could not have encounter with lack in any other form that wasn't more anxiety producing or maybe even deconstructing. Maybe the daydreaming is the prerequisite of the subject to be capable of to encounter lack, as then pointing to a non-relation that, even though that would mean you can't have the ideal relationship, does mean you can have the continual processing, dare I say, toward the beautiful or something. So that's interesting to think. I'm also wondering, as just a quick note, if there's something about sick, there's some people that make the point, like when your body has a fever, that means it's trying to heal itself, right? Like a fever, sickness, these are kind of things where the body's trying to heal itself. Is there something where boredom is the body trying to heal itself by saying you need to get outside and work with, maybe work with your hands or be creative? Is there actually like a health response in a sense, like a mental health where like that is a symptom of your body trying to be a fuller human being? You're spending way too much time on something, like your repetition has lost the capacity of excess maybe. Now this is interesting because we tend to, it will be interesting to know the difference between repetitions that cause boredom and repetitions that feel more like a freedom. That, because there are repetitions that feel like a freedom because you know what to do versus the repetition that feels boring. Maybe that's the difference between external force and internal cultivation. But there's something I wonder if there's a feeling of boredom in the bad sense. It depends on what we mean. Again, that is your body's like, hey, you need to go touch grass. That's it, Mr. Joe. You need to go friggin' touch some grass. That's why you're bored. That's interesting. I wonder if there's a health thing, but let me give it to Christian, Mr. Luber, and then Sam Willem. So, Christian, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Good to see you as well. I'm realizing if you're even 15 minutes late for this conversation, you're going to miss a whole lot. So many words per minute. So I'm like, gosh, what am I missing in terms of context? But like I have a little laundry list of things that have popped up in my mind while everyone was talking. One, if I was hearing everyone correctly, or I think it's just you, Daniel, this idea of like paying to be kind of cut off from everything else. In South Korea, they already offer that. There are these like tiny little apartment cells. That's like a kind of like a comfy little prison where people who are overworked and overstressed, they go and they have to turn in all of their devices and all of this, and they get locked in a little room for some amount of time. I think I read it was like 2 weeks, or maybe it was the average. And they do it just so that as kind of a forced, way to get away from everything else. And obviously not everyone can afford to do that, but some can. I always thought that was as an interesting cultural adaptation to whatever you want to call it, the modern situation. I'm also reminded of one of my most frequently returned to, or at least most frequently quoted Bible verses. Do I even remember the book? I think it's Ecclesiastes chapter 4. I'll have to double check that, but it goes something like, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. But better one handful of quietness than two hands full of striving and chasing after wind. And to me, that's maybe kind of rhymes with what's being discussed here, this kind of middle ground, where, we could say that the fool who has folded his hands and is, self-consuming, is stuck in boredom. It's a malady, really, I believe, boredom. And then on the other hand, you've got the capitalist situation where you're constantly striving after wind, just always efforting towards some goal, never with relaxation, with surrender. But it's just a nice little visual, like one handful of quietness rather than two hands full of vexation, I think, and striving after wind. Just what could be like a simpler way to talk about moderation, the middle way, as they would say in Buddhism. It's like, all right, one hand open, one hand on the plow, doing your work, doing what you got to do, but not both hands on the plow. One hand working, one hand open, one hand quiet. It's just a nice little, it always stuck out to me as a nice little poetic way of talking about finding that nice middle path. What one other thing was popping up? Oh yeah, the conditions by which, this is in response to your most recent comment there, Daniel. Like, what are the conditions by which daydreaming, as you're putting it, can lead to insight, transformation, etc.? I have one interesting personal reference point for this. When I was 18, just out of high school, I had my first job, and I had an hour and 45-minute bus ride each way to and from my job. And that became an interesting space in my day. And of course, and this was before iPhones, just a little bit before iPhones anyway. And I didn't bring a book or anything, so I just had myself and my thoughts. And I started to do a lot of daydreaming, and it led to really profound transformations. And at the energetic level, like it felt like my heart was opening up, all this kind of shit. And I've reflected a lot on that and asked the question, what were the causes and conditions for that? Because normally you can't just prescribe someone to sit on a bus for an hour, 45 minutes and talk and expect transformation. So what the hell was going on there? And I can't say I know for sure, but I can give you like my reflections. One, I think there's the role of the body and somatics. I would start my day by running to the bus stop because I was always late. So getting my, blood oxygenated, heart rate up, that's something. Two, I would try to sleep on the bus as much as possible, which put me in an interesting state because I had a couple stops and I couldn't miss my stops. So I was trying to sleep without sleeping. And that put me into a very meditative state where I was, not engaging in like regular conscious thought. I was trying to really shut myself down, but keeping a little bit of my awareness up. So some little antenna would notice when they would call my bus stop. And that was a really interesting meditative state, right? It's like very much like I think traditional forms of meditation are attempting to achieve. And so you have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then the content of what I would daydream about. Two things I'll notice here. One, I was doing real work where I wasn't just daydreaming about any old thing. I was trying to. I was basically doing like self-therapy. I didn't realize it at the time, but taking up uncomfortable emotional experiences I've had and feelings and attitudes that I maintained and examining them. Not in necessarily a self-critical way, but more just like trying to understand them as legitimately as I could. So there's a lot of work there being done between the mind and the heart. So it's not just heady stuff. It was a dialogue between my thoughts and feelings. So when I think the content of what you're daydreaming about is huge there, and if your thoughts are kind of disconnected from your feelings, maybe that's going to very much limit how far those thoughts are going to take you in terms of transformation. And then the second thing was that I think I was doing a little bit of concentration practice, another form of meditation. Well, maybe I don't know what I want to call it, but essentially every day I would try to my best to pick up my thoughts from the previous day. And I would over time get better and better at that. And then over time also get better and better at not getting distracted by these like little rabbit trails of thoughts that were kind of taking me away from what the emotional core of my inquiry was. And so that was, that's similar to other meditative practices, right? You keep bringing your attention back to the intended object of your attention. In this case, it was not my breath. It was not a dot, a candle flame, or a mantra. It was an inquiry. So it was like kind of an interesting mix of philosophy and meditation. Because on the one hand, there's this active engagement. There's a flow. There was, one thought preceding another. There was unpacking and asking questions and exploring. But on the other hand, there was this deep commitment to the space of inquiry staying grounded in a central idea and question. And I could notice myself when my thoughts were just kind of getting a little loose and away from that. So a bit of a discipline there in the mind and teaching it how to stay focused. That itself is transformational. That opens up your ability to think differently, to explore your attitudes as they arise in different ways. Anyways, I'm rambling a bit, but yeah, those are some of the things that came up.
You are not rambling at all. That's magnificent. I'll give it to Luber and Sam. And so first, South Korea owes Alex Ebert some freaking royalties for, that idea. They stole that idea. That's one way to get out of your World of Warcraft addiction. Second, what you would describe. So it's very different because I don't want to demonize boredom, but there seems to be a difference between boredom, this kind of existential and this daydreaming that you're describing. And then I'll pass it to Luber because I know how to run. But that what you were just describing on the bus, this kind of dreamy state that also has some sort of deep ability to kind of go into this place of thinking thoughts that are outside the flow of the immediacy. This seems to be tied to the question of leaving Plato's cave on one's own, or making sure that if you end up in a cave, you're able to leave again because you're able to think thoughts beyond that. But Mr. Luber, I know you had a question, sir.
Oh my God, I feel like I'm about to sneeze. Yeah, so just wanted to ask this question, I guess, like with your description with like the bus. So first, I'll just say where my question comes from. Like, I guess it really applies to like the male experience, considering like that's my experience. But it's like the classic, like I had sex, and then right after I like finished, I like was thoughtless. Like I couldn't think of anything. I didn't really care to do anything. I just wanted to sit there and lay back and like didn't really give a shit about anything. Like in that sense, there's like a certain boredom that arises out of the sex. So it's like, what does like if you're bored after a certain activity, what does it say about that activity that it produces boredom? And then like just to like kind of like finish my thought is yes, post nut clarity, exactly, Jock. And I just wanted to be, I didn't want to be vulgar. I didn't know if this is the space to be vulgar, but fuck it. Let's be a little vulgar. It's like you can have daydreaming on the bus. So it's like you do the activity of riding on the bus and it produces like a lack of post-nut clarity, if you will. But then let's say you have sex and then you have the post-nut clarity after the sex. Like, does that mean the sex isn't good in the sense that it's producing a boredom? But let's say I have like the best sex ever. Like I have the greatest sex ever, and then I still have that like post-nut clarity. I mean, in that sense, it's not actually good sex because you're not like daydreaming after. Like the way you guys are talking about it's making me think if you're not daydreaming after your post-nut, then the activity, the who you're having sex with, if you will, it's not good because it's producing boredom and not the daydreaming. I don't know. I just wanted to ask this question. I have to hop off, so I'll listen or I'll hop back on if I can. But yeah, if someone can answer so I can listen to the net after. But yeah.
No, that's excellent. I'll give it to Sam and then to Christian. And I think it's an excellent question. Well, to me, what's increasingly clear, especially in an AI world, I suppose, if there is something about it is clear that busyness, being a busybody, is problematic. And it seems like boredom is a way to address having nothing to do this problem, this tyranny of busyness, like Ahan will talk about. But then there also seems to be a problematic form of that boredom that needs to lead to something like quote unquote daydreaming, if we keep using that phrase, right? In the same way that philosophy is better than not philosophy, because without philosophy, you're in the banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt talks about. But with philosophy, you can get into tyranny, anxiety, and all these other problems. So there's this idea of philosophy that comes into service of wonder or beauty or return to common life, right? So likewise, what's interesting is, yeah, there's a kind of, is there a difference between, it's almost like we're in an age where we have to become refined about our doing nothing, like a kind of refinedness in the shades of doing nothing. There's a doing nothing that's a serenity. There's a doing nothing that is a lack of care. There's a doing nothing that is you are dependent on stimulation by something external from you. There is a doing nothing that is finding an inner peace where you don't need to do something. It's almost like we as a society, maybe we can put it this way. Maybe we have not, as a society, developed a language of doing nothing because we haven't had the socioeconomic condition where it has been needed so much. And now increasingly it is. So we need a more refined language. And, Rita Dove, I always liked it. Rita Dove has that idea kind of playing, with Wittgenstein says the limits of my language are the limits of my world. That would suggest that the expressions of my language are the expressions of my world. And Rita Dove puts it that whenever we lose a word, we lose a capacity of experience. And so the poet is in this business of generating new terms, because without those terms, you're more likely to confuse what you're experiencing with something else and thus lose it. So for example, you might confuse daydreaming with a kind of failure to be productive, feel bad about it, and then lose the daydreaming state that would take you into out of the flow of market into action, and thus the individual, right? So it's almost like there is that, and there's a possibility where being bored after sex, I'm not up to terms with the lexicon of the children. That could be bad, but maybe it's a sign of serenity. It depends. Maybe that's a sign of true love. It depends on what we mean. This is where it's interesting, because it's almost like we're in an age of needing more refined language or thinking about the doing of nothing, which then, of course, would make sense if we're in an age of a distinction between lack and nothing, because that's a refined distinction, and thus there is a new lexicon that is so needed. So those are things that come to mind. But let me give it to Sam and then Christian. Sam, it is good to see you. I hope you're doing well.
It's great to see you. I feel like I'm just going to pick up right where you left off, Daniel, because I may just say what you just said, actually, because I just came from French class. And when we say we're doing nothing, in learning a second language, you quickly realize that being, doing, having, these are all words that are just massive umbrella terms for certain states of action. And you can apply them in a lot of different areas. There's many things you can do that, you can do something, and you can make something, and you can fabricate something. And it's sort of like a narrowing articulation of a meaning. And so when we're doing nothing, you know, like what do we really mean? I mean, I really enjoy OG Rose, your Substacks when you get into terms and just unpacking terms, because and you recently had one on brainwashing, and I thought that was great. And we need to be more specific. You know, language is the tool of philosophy very often. And recently I thought I'd bring this to the conversation. I've lately been interested, since last coming to the net, on the question, like, between the distinction between training and labor. You can find various musings and book excerpts on my Twitter about that. I have a little thread growing. But because of that, I recently, this morning actually, I listened to a few seminars on Hannah Arendt's on the human condition, and you just brought that up. And I think the way that she uses terms very specifically when she divides the vita activa into labor, work, and the last one is action, I guess that's the translation. I think that's like, and it's a nice narrowing and articulation of like, how can we do nothing? Like, are we laboring nothing, or are we working nothing, or are we actioning nothing? Like, it's helpful to think in those more specified terms. And one of the things, actually, I would like to take a little tangent and say that when I was listening to these seminars, I won't cite them, but I was like, dang, the quality of discussion that's going on between these individuals, like, it was good enough to like give me the lowdown on the chapter that I was interested in, because I haven't actually read the book. But I just thought, like, wow, I am so lucky to be able to, somehow chance has brought me to this group of people where there's like a really high quality of discussion going on. I feel very blessed to be able to participate in this. So that is my tangent of gratitude, and for my friends. Back to the seminars. One of the things that they brought up in the seminar was that, and again, I haven't read the book, so forgive me, but they did bring up something about like not being not tired enough to sleep. So like in the spectrum that she lays out of the vita activa, you can labor, you can work, and you can act, and she gives them a kind of hierarchy. But like she also notices in history a transfer of dominance or priority towards labor rather than action. And but at the same time, they remarked during this seminar that like sometimes we as moderns are too tired to sleep. And I thought that's kind of like, you know, like there's a form of boredom which is a bit stultifying and maybe consumptive, in which you might just be up all night, you know, because you haven't actually like done enough to like expend the day's energy and get to sleep soundly. But there are other forms of boredom, and maybe they're daydreaming, and maybe they, you know, maybe they are acting, thinking a new thought or something, which really does expend the day's energy. And it's maybe not productive in the sense of producing something, but energy is used to a point where, you know, the person feels able to sleep. And I wanted to link this to what was just said about like, you know, like waiting for the bus and being bored, and in different the phenomenology of being bored. I kind of wanted to add to that discussion just some like, you know, little like anthropological factoids that you kind of pick up along the way when reading. Ideas like when people have brain injuries wherein their parts of their brain used for language are injured or removed or something, like people can still sing lyrics to songs because like there's a different, you know, like complex in the brain used for music than for language. And also the idea that like, you know, we're often like saying I'm bored in the sense that like I is a coherent whole, and there, I do think there is a sense in which an I is a coherent whole, but there's also senses in which, you know, there are parts of, you know, like we're composed of many psyches, and like, I mean, you can cite many different theories from probably the 18th century to now where people believe that like, you know, the spine has a thinking, the brain has a thinking, this the sacral or what is it, the sacrum, that complex of nerves in that complex of nerves right under your diaphragm, I don't know, but that itself has a sort of mode of thought, and that like I think we can connect those sort of like that little like conceptual theme of facts with the phenomenology of being bored, because it's like I find sometimes when I'm laboring, maybe I'm in the garden doing just like subsistence work, keeps my hands busy. And once my hands are content, my mind is free of the urges of the way that it feels. My mind becomes free of the urges of the hand. I don't have to think about the hands that are happy. It's able to think about something else. Or sometimes when I'm designing, I'm in 3D space, kind of making a model, but my language brain is like, hey, you're giving me nothing to do, so I'll listen to the net and I'll talk, you know, like there's sort of like all these different parts of you, and they get bored in different ways and they do nothing in different ways. But there is like a harmony point, and I feel like that's like a flow state, an active flow state, wherein maybe if I can be so bold as to like stand on Hannah's shoulders, like you're both laboring, working, and acting like all in one like gesture.
Magnificent comment, and we are blessed to have you, Sam. So thank you for being here, and thank you for your kind words. And I'm glad you like those pieces on language. I was always deeply kind of taken by that notion of Rita Dove and kind of this idea that language matters, because just like you're saying on work, labor, and action from the great Hannah Arendt, like what does it mean to work lack, labor lack, action lack? What does it mean to work nothing, labor nothing, act nothing? I think that provides a certain framing, because it's a certain relation to the phenomenon that is being discussed that changes the kind of taste or the practicing or undergoing of that phenomenon. That seems to be very important today, because if indeed you have something about an increasing doing nothing that kind of defines things, then our ability to relate to that in perhaps a more harmonious manner becomes extremely important. So I really appreciate that language. What's interesting to me, it's a different subject, and then I'll give it to Christian and Philip here, is if what's so odd is if indeed, following some of the sociologists, and I know Owen has been doing work on the individual who talks about the socialization from the warrior class to the clergy class, or this movement that in the West, there was this movement to kind of increasingly more intellectual work. You would think that would have been like great for action, right? And yet, ironically, the socialization in that direction has hurt all of that. And now you have more of, you know, I guess you could talk about Burkham, the professional managerial class, maybe it's Buckingham, I'm not quite sure. Like you have this movement of less work that should have been, oh, great, contemplatio, oh, via action, that's great. No, actually, which then right there almost suggests that achieving the kind of harmony that you're describing can't merely be a matter of sitting at a desk, but you need to work with your hands, or otherwise something is missed that takes away your capacity in the other areas. And I think that's very interesting. And then, yeah, I just think for me too, and then I'll pass it to Christian and then Philip, and Tyler had a wonderful question I will look at, is this idea. I know for me, like if I start feeling like I'm not getting anywhere in this book, like that's to me a sign of go fixing the car. Like the boredom, if you will, or the inability to focus, which I think a lot of people define boredom as I can't focus on this, or I'm bored with it. That's what's weird. This word is used in many different ways. I guess I always interpret that as I was saying, like if you have a fever, that means your body is trying to get better. If you're bored, some other part of your body is saying, hey, you need to actually address me, or you're out of that harmony between the action and the labor and the work, and kind of letting that follow you. But then like what Ibo was saying earlier, if there's a guilt, no, you should be able to finish an entire book on one setting. No, you shouldn't be bored because you're not allowed to follow the signals of your body in that sense, right? So I think that's very interesting. And then also, again, this is all fascinating to me because there's something here that is about the capacity of the human being to think outside of their immediacy, thus to leave Plato's cave on their own. I'm going to pass it to Christian if you still wanted to speak, Christian, and then I will give it to Philip. Christian.
There's I'm just like a machine that spits out anecdotes and stories. My friend Justin, and I'll plug his band, by the way, PC Worship, such a fun band to see live. He told me once how, when he was younger, he would do acid all the time. And when he would be on acid, he'd realize that doing nothing isn't boring. And then he said one day that feeling, and he also said that, life just would feel more vibrant, like a comic book or something, I think is the word he used, more full of a sense of inherent adventure and vitality. And then one day he did acid, and the next morning he woke up and he felt like he was still on acid, and it's just always been that way ever since. But that sense of doing nothing but not being bored, that's I think that more kind of tranquil aspect of quietness and stillness that's been brought up sometimes. The word boring is interesting. My etymological nerdy mind wants to dig into that more. I won't dig in much, but I believe it comes from the idea of like a bore, like the way that a drill bores a hole, right? And I think you bring up a great point, Daniel, to look at boredom not as necessarily a state, but more of a feeling. So if I'm bored by something, it's like painful. Like I want to go. This fucking, it's not my friends. It's the band that's opening for my friend's really good band, and they're so boring. And it's not just like it means nothing to me. It's actually uncomfortable for me to have to pay attention to this musical performance. I am bored by it. I want to get the fuck out. And when you bring up this point, Daniel, of not suppressing the emotional, somatic feeling of being bored, I think that's so important. That to me is very different than obviously saying you should seek out boredom. Boredom is good. No, like if boredom is a feeling, don't ignore it. It's trying to tell you something. I really like that. Rather than looking at it as like, yeah, I am in a bored state, or I want to, whatever, do something within the space of boredom. I that doesn't make as much sense to me as to how you just put it there, Daniel. And the last thing I'll add in here is the idea, something I've been thinking about lately, which is the idea of vacation. I've been trying to have a fucking vacation for so long, and things just keep popping up, and I keep having to say, oh no, I guess I'm not going to go surfing in Costa Rica. I guess I'm not going to go to the hot springs in New Mexico, and that's some blah, blah, blah. And I'm starting to think, like, when will I get to go on vacation? Because I really want to. I've been like hustling really hard for a couple of years now, and not getting paid for it. But anyway, and so I've decided I'm going to try something. And this somewhat harkens back to my bus story. I'm going to try to wake up really early every morning, like 5 a.m., and just have a little morning vacation, and explore what that might mean, and how effective that can be, where I have the early wee hours of my day where I as best I can try to free myself from the fetters of the many demands, whether they're ones I resonate with or not. Because that it's another thing that I know I reflected on with those bus rides. I was 18 at the time, and had the sense of freedom that comes with leaving the folks' house, which I think empowered me to like follow my thoughts wherever they may lead, but also not yet captured by all the demands of independent adult life, right? Not yet worried about am I spending my time towards some productive end? Am I furthering a career or this or that ambition? It was truly just like this nice little liminal space between, I'll call it childhood and adulthood, where I had a very strong sense of freedom to just do whatever, to daydream. And I'm wondering if in my mornings I can cultivate that a little bit, cultivate a little space where I am free from my many responsibilities, and see what that does for me. See if that helps serve the purpose that I hope to get from a vacation, which is some rejuvenation, some space to collect my thoughts, to make sure I'm oriented with my deeper self, find deeper alignment, process things that maybe I'm not getting an opportunity to process, and generally just feeling better in my body and my energy levels. Anyway, that's all I had.
Yes, absolutely. The morning is like, first off, I hope you get that vacation. Second, anecdotes and stories are the stuff of philosophy. So I love your stories. And also, actually, I think it is really hurt philosophy to not bring in stories and instead use things like symbolic logic or whatever. But also, morning is, before I forget, Sam, that idea of like, I was really taken by the idea of you say, I'm bored. And it's funny how we never say we're bored, because it's kind of easy to say we're happy or we're sad. There's something interesting on, like, it feels weird to say we're bored. How would you even say that? There's something uniquely atomistic about it. I'd have to think more about it, but that was an interesting point, how it just kind of feels natural to say I'm bored, but weird to say we're bored. That's kind of weird, but it feels easier to say we're happy or we're sad. So that would, I'll have to think on that, but that was very interesting. My life sucks without getting up early. Getting up early is really like, it sets the entire day, because it's like this sacred daydreamy space. Like, you know, if you get up at 6, like I tend to try like 6:15, because you have at least 2 hours of this liminal daydreaming space, and the whole world feels like it's coming alive and you have energy, and it sets this. Like when I had times because of work or whatever, where my mornings were taken like at 5 a.m. or whatever, or like getting up at 9, it's radical to me how different the day is. And also I find it harder to fall asleep like at night if you get up at like 8, but if you get up at 6, well, then it comes to like, by the time you get to 6 p.m., you've been up for 12 hours. And to your name, Chris, I think Bonhoeffer said that morning is the time for the Christian. So, you know, here you go. Morning is the time for the Christian. And to me, the daydreaming space, that dwelling, Ivan Illich dwelling, right? And then I'll pass it to Philip, Jockin, and then Javier. Having a regular experience of that does make life kind of feel beautiful, more beautiful. You go into the day with this different orientation. I'm just speaking to me now. And how that ability to start, let me put it this way. You start the day in action, and then maybe go to utility, versus start the day in utility and then maybe go to action, and you never get to the action because by the end of the day you're tired and exhausted or whatever. Like I've always found it so important to have at least an hour, even if I have to go to work at 6, it doesn't matter. Like if you have that hour to exist in the liminal daydreaming, falling asleep on the bus space, that seems to have something to do with the dusting, as Tyler was saying at the beginning, something to do with this encounter of the lack of the beauty, or the reminding of the action of which then sets you up in a very different way. And to me, it's an act of observing beauty. Like there is, just to comment on Javier's question, there is this push where people like, get up early. It depends. Like if it's this cold shower, like Javier is like this cold shower, get up at 4:45 a.m. and then you'll start your entrepreneurship. I think, to me, getting up early is observing dare I say, it's kind of observing life at its most spiritual. I don't know, at its most beautiful. There's something about the morning, and maybe you really see it on the farm as well. So there's probably a geographical bias as well. But the quality of light in the morning, the quality of how your brain is in the morning has a radical transformation. Javier, what is that, sir?
I just want to ask, so when you describe this experience, does it feel like you're disciplining yourself to do this, or do you already feel like you don't really have to put much effort, like it's already a drive that's going?
It's a great question. The first 3 days when the alarm clock goes off at 6:15, it truly sucks, but then you just do it. Your body, like the thing is, what's interesting, in my opinion, the best disciplines vanish from being disciplines. Like once you have to decide, I know that the morning has this special quality to it. So I'm going to choose to get up at 6:15 because also we use Michelle and I, you know, back like you could do 5:15, but if you have a lot of calls or work at 10, you got to pick a time that's sustainable. You have to pick a time where the repetition then becomes automatic. Your body just wakes up at 6:15. You don't even have to set an alarm. And that's when it's weird because to me, discipline moves into this kind of automatic. But the reason you're doing it is for the observation of the beauty, if you will, or to be in the liminal space. And it feels like a vacation. I like how Christian said, because it's hard. It's hard to like go surfing or to go do different things. Not that I can surf, I cannot surf. But you know, this is where in the same way, like you were talking with Gino, then I'll pass it to Philip and Chuck, there's a form of discipline that seems problematic, which is we're disciplined for discipline's sake. That doesn't seem correct. But then there's also a problem with like, discipline don't matter. It depends on what you mean, right? Like stuff that creates beauty and like that requires something like discipline. But it's almost like, because I'm obsessed with beauty, as we talk about all the time, and the way Mr. Jockin describes it is so important, there seems to be a difference between the discipline that's linked with the observing of beauty versus the discipline of I'm going to be the CEO of a company, right? There seems to be a difference there. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean trying to be the CEO of a company is bad. It just seems like it's like Sam was saying with the action, you know, the labor and the work, they have to be harmonized, right? These things have to be put together. And to me, the getting up early radically, the day also has more of a sense to it because you're getting tired at like dark as opposed to before it's midnight and you're not tired, right? Like there's something where you feel out of alignment with the world in its unfolding, if you will. You're finding a discipline to align with the determinations of the day. Now, I'm not saying that therefore everyone should get up early in the morning or whatever. You know, I can't make that claim, but I have found that there is something about my favorite times of day are the early morning and the golden hour at night. The middle of the day is the wasteland when you're sleepy and want to take a nap. When the sun's right overhead, it's a wasteland. But in the morning and in the evening, where you have that interesting quality of light, hey, it's interesting because I guess you could say it's more of the environment of lack because you have the shadows. It's not like clear up and down light. It's more environmentally. It feels kind of more mysterious. Definitely getting up early in the morning feels like participating in mystery. I'm going to stop now. But yes, I was just going to say, Christian, getting up in the morning is great. I cannot agree more with the power of doing that and just starting your day in action because people ain't going to you're not going to get called in the morning. Anyway, Philip, you're a beautiful soul.
The night and the day are both alike, and you know, finding what kind of works for you. And I do think like just kickstarting the stuff. You're right with that. I was like a Jocko Willing guy myself for a while, and I think it's similar to people bash ego therapism, but like going through Anna Freud to get an ego that can then be analyzed by a Lacanian or Freudian psychoanalyst might be a good play. You know, my grandma would sometimes, and I'm sure he stole this from someone else. She would sometimes say, "Bill, you're doing nothing." He would say, "I'm making sperm." That was his thing. So I think it's like real interesting thing, especially what Sam was talking about. Like my acting training has a lot to do with the involuntary breathing apparatus. So we focus a lot on loosening the outer abdominal layer so that the more subtle inner abdominal layer could take care of the breath. And indeed, a lot of people do suffer a lot of physiological problems due to how they breathe. And in our capitalist day, this is usually the downstream effect of an overly taut rectum. And this can like really, you know, be directly linked to how you think about money. I just want to share one story too. When I was teaching in Danbury, Connecticut, I would commute from the city, and it was 3 hours on the train, one way, and then 3 hours back. So it was like very, very similar. Had like a wonderful time thinking and focusing and concentrating. There was like one transfer. So I wonder if that could be like something to encourage, you know, like everyone's like, oh, commuting sucks, this, that, and the other thing. It's like, oh, well, what if you just like double or triple it, you know, and then it gets to a level where it's like, oh, this might actually take this thing that's terrible and lead, you know, makes people just like angry and lead to like deeper thinking. And then there was like one day I had to go to a faculty meeting and I like quit right after that. So that probably tells you more about me than you wanted to know. I was like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever been to. I don't want to teach it. But yeah, I wonder, okay, so as far as like,
You muted yourself, Philip.
You muted yourself, Philip. You muted yourself. Unmute yourself. I'll unmute you. Will it let you? There he is.
oh, can you not hear me?
No, we hear you now. There you are.
Just where do you draw the line between doing nothing and doing something? And like, I had this fun wordplay where with belonging again. Like I was thinking about like belongings, you know, like if we could, is this like a redistributive call? Like,
would people be able to, you know, if we had more access to housing, healthcare, weren't so worried about all this, would we feel more, you know, at ease and at home with the people around us instead of in kind of an antagonistic relationship? Yeah, that's all I got.
No, that's magnificent. And I should note, there have been periods of time in my life where I've been the very late, the night owl, where the night owls are like, what the frick is wrong with you? So I have had phases of staying up late. I definitely think it just feels like if you look at your life and say, wow, there is some sort of, but this is another, there's a form of exhaustion that is this existential, I never get a vacation, which is like for me, boredom saying you need to do something different. Maybe you should try a morning schedule. Which is different from the tiredness that is the thrill in the Anna Karenina where they cut the fields and there's this glorious tiredness of we did an amazing day's work, right? So that's another example of being able to tell the difference between those, right? And I certainly have found in getting older and work with the venue and get like the early morning I've always preferred that because it has this sort of life to it that you're going in, but certainly I don't want to moralize. But if one in their life is feeling, there is some sort of inability to get into action, I would certainly say that morning is a great avenue. I also was always taken just reading all the biographers of writers who got up early, because that is in the daydreaming. You know, very few of them, other than Joyce, because he just didn't care, is getting up at 10 a.m. Everyone else is like 7 or 6 or freaking 5 or whatever. And it's because or I guess Bolzac is drinking coffee till 2 a.m. or something. But, you know, he's staying up all night. But there's this idea that the morning, because it's the Butler book, From Where Dreams Come, there you go, Emmett Coy, talks about the daydreaming is where the creative, this state of it's like your mind is between sleep and awake. And that for them is where this special thought happens, this quality of thought. And this is what's very interesting to me. So the stories of if you're commuting, if you're on the bus, and you're like choosing to just kind of be in this place of non-action, a kind of quality of thinking can arise that is different from the thinking of solving a math problem, very active, very willed thought, or the thinking of, I don't know, like thoughtlessness. There's like a drifty, daydreamy kind of thought that seems to be really linked with orbiting lack, beauty, creativity. And this is why it seems like we don't want to demonize boredom, because it's something like boredom that can reach some sort of point that brings in this quality of thought that seems incredibly humanizing. I was also going to note, on the breathing, I didn't know about mewing though. That just makes me think about Pokemon, Mew or whatever. Like I always loved how, and then I'll give it to Javier. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin and then Javier. Is my beloved Jeffrey Lupino Esposito. He always told me, I think it's the Alexander technique. When you do acting, the importance of like walking, you don't even realize like a baby has perfect posture and everything, and how you learn how to walk. You learn how to breathe and all of these things for acting, and it has a dramatic impact on energy, how you feel, what you're capable of doing. And he did a lovely series with Matt called In Strange Woods as a kind of musical. It's quite wonderful. So there is something to be said about the body and the movement of the body and the actions of the body that seem to correlate with the kind of thinking. And I guess I find in the morning, I find if I sit in a chair in the afternoon, I'm more likely to feel sluggish. Where if I might use the standy desk, or if I'm sitting at a table in the morning, it doesn't feel sluggish. It actually feels more like the contemplatio, if you will. It feels more like the kind of daydreaming. So it's interesting how the same actions in different times, I have to think about that, have different impacts on if you're in action or busyness or different things. But let me give it to Jockin and then Javier. Mr. Thomas Jockin.
Yeah, I've been coming on the background to chat with all of my Zoomer euphemisms about all these dynamics. I just find it interesting because it shows that the culture is addressing, that's how I put it, they're using language to try to describe these phenomenons that we're discussing. I just want to point that out as enough that that's what I was resonating when I was hearing everybody talk. I think all this is about relationship to time. I mean, that's kind of like I'm picking up as a read on all this. I say this because, Daniel, your whole comment about like getting up early, all this other stuff, for all the stuff that we kind of like take shit on self-help, I've always been sympathetic to 7 Habits. Yes, it gets co-opted as just the productivity hack life, but I don't think Covey's model, he's naive. I don't think he realizes that could have been co-opted into what it became, but I think there's a lot of value in it. Like, Daniel, what you're talking about is proactivity, put first things first, start with the end in mind. Like, that's basically what we're pointing out here. And the main point is, you're buying time, because that's the point, is that you're up early because there's a stillness in the morning. There's no demands put on you. You're not being acted upon. You get to have space for you to act, right? In this case, giving yourself a space for you to mentally think, especially and not in a utilitarian kind of optimized way. That's kind of the point, because the whole thing from Stephen Covey on put first things first is that there's kind of, he uses a corporate kind of 4-modality mode. What most relevant to us is that things that are not urgent but important. Most people live their lives in operations of urgency. They're always addressing the fires, the emergencies, and especially things that are urgent need to be that act upon them and is important. Those things obviously get top priority. Covey makes a point about the usual people do is they fluctuate between quadrant 1, which is the urgent and important, to then the not important, not urgent, procrastination, the idling, right? All this other stuff, right? And he says the first act of proactivity for freedom is you gotta shift your ratios. The ratios of your time spent needs to be moved. It's a moral act, because that's we talked this before, Daniel, that one of the kind of the odd signs of what is the moral is the question of where do I choose to sacrifice my time? Where do I choose to use it? I'm going to have to spend it. My substance is being spent away. One of the examples from Aristotle is that, the prodigalness means to waste one's substance. I just find that immensely entertaining from Aristotle about that point. But the point is that you're spending your substance and time. So the question is, what would you spend that time with? What's it going to go to? So I think the operation of using the still times where things are not acting upon you, you get this open space. You almost have a relationship to, one can make an argument this is a preparation for death, in the sense that when we die, regardless of the question what happens after, there is nothing, like, you will be confronted with no acting. There will be no to do, in the sense of like, there's no more of the optimizations to worry about. That's it. It's kind of concluded on that point. You want to do more, that's fine, but I kind of feel like if you're basically pained in boredom, you're probably not going to do very well in the afterlife. I'm just saying. I just think I chew on that point. But one last note about that. It's interesting because also one can make the argument, because I forgot someone talked about like a band, right? That I apologize who spoke about that, but it's kind of interesting that that whole comment, Daniel, you made out about the individuation of boredom. It seems odd That's why I bring about death, because everyone's death is individual. No one gets to share your death. No one gets to take your death for you. You get your own. That's a very Heidegger point. I think it's very relevant here. The same content, the same event, same activity could be immensely entertaining and satisfying and elucidating and enlightening for one individual, be complete boredom for the other. For example, if we talk about typography, it's literally in my, like, it's in my soul. Like, I can sit here and talk forever about it. I can talk about all the nuances about it, all the, like, I am abiding in the prism of that account. But for anyone else who's not in typography, they can give a shit. They can maybe spend 5 minutes and they go, okay, cool, that's enough. It's like that kind of meme of like the pizza pie, which keeps getting sliced into smaller and smaller fractions, and it's like, enough. That's enough. That's enough slices. But someone who's like in the passion of that account, they can keep going forever about it, now can't they? It's definitely a mark of their character. So I'm calling from Phaedrus, the mark of a person's soul. How you know yourself is about what you love, because you get to be abiding in it. You have no desire to be away from the thing you love. So I sit here thinking about that, and I'm kind of chewing on this point. It's like, I find that we're kind of stuck with this relationship to time. I don't think we have good accounts to it. And I think that's kind of what the Zoomers are trying to address with their language in different modes and ways. And maybe they're not that successful. They're trying to, but they're not that successful. But like, the point is like touching grass. Like, why? Why does that mean? Like, when we talk about that meme of touch grass, what that's saying is that the virtual dynamics of the internet space and everything about it is fucking you up. You're getting run around spiral and basically runaway spiral virtualness. Go touch reality, in the sense that nature has, see, it's interesting because nature has all its fractal patterns, right? And it has its kind of infiniteness in that sense, but it's different. It's not virtual. That's the point, is that you're getting to interact with something that's not virtual. That's what nature is giving you. There's a lot of wisdom in that meme of go touch grass. Even there are other examples about like breathing, how we breathe and how we operate with our bodies, like the mouth breathing and mewing. You know, that's look maxing. It's more that. But the point is, like, there's definitely like a lot of wisdom being implied in there in these memes, but we don't really take it that way. We just think it's like jokes, whatever. But I think I'll kind of close out. I don't know, man. I mean, I kind of feel like it's also just, I think our accounts of time, which is we talk about with beauty, has this relationship to time, right? So it's almost like, until we address these questions of time and our psychology about it, that's the thing. A lot of this is all about our psychological states related to time, no? But what I'm kind of getting at here in closing note is, you know, by the way, the pain of boredom, or the time tension of like, do you discipline yourself? Do you not? There's a contention of the question of, do I need to change, or does reality need to change? And how does that mediate it? This is no different than basically a Unitarian argument of, is all pleasure good or is all pain bad? I think I'm going to stand hard and say that's not true. There's clearly times when pain is good. It has to be. But that's because pain, unfortunately, is a subjective experience that we might be misaligned, right? We're the instrument that's messed up, and we need to be corrected. But that leads to a whole bunch of questions, like, how do we know this? And But I just want to point out that these are the contentions I'm seeing, but one of the most important ones is this operation of time, and basically this question of abiding in our accounts. And that's demonstrating a lot of who we are. And ultimately, to close out from 7 Habits, where do we choose to spend our time is declaring who we are. And that's the point about the commuting, right? You have a 3-hour commute. You can choose to listen to a bunch of bullshit on YouTube or whatever, or you can go listen to some audiobooks on philosophy or Plato, or like that choice. That's a choice of time, how you choose to do it. And that's a call of who you're going to be. I'll close with that.
No, that's delightful. And I'll pass it to Mr. Rivera. And then if anyone has any final things, please. So a few things come to mind. I find it very interesting that in this age where we have collapsed space, you know, with digital technologies, then the essentialness of our relation to time is now kind of coming forth. In a sense, we've defeated space. And so that leads to a certain exhaustion of space, which then leads to an increasing awareness that there's some relation of time that has not been articulated. And I think what's very interesting, like when you're talking about kids making up language, that's just an example. If philosophers don't do the work of language, it's still going to be done. It just might be sloppy, not as useful, and lead to confusion, in the same way that everyone's going to have ideas, The question is, are they going to be good ideas or lead to anxiety or different things? And that's where, to me, the language philosophers were getting at something. But the problem is that it then got into the whole signifier signified divide, as opposed to, for me, Wittgenstein should have taken, although I have a lot of fondness for Wittgenstein, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. I just like to say that the expressions of my language are the expressions of my world. So your language and the expressions go together. You can mean that by limit, but that led for him to a lot of more of a kind of apophatic Christian mysticism for him, which again, I have great sympathies for. But I think the primacy of language as poetic language, which you could say Heidegger gets into later in life, is really important for the philosopher to think. And it also gets tied to, if you go back to Plato and all of them, sort of looking for okay, well, what do we mean by justice? Like I was always taken by how all of these dialogues tend to kind of be like, well, let's kind of explore that. Is that what it means? It's funny because the dialogues are almost like a dictionary, like looking for the definition. What do we mean by this term, dang it? It's like it's like a dictionary and yet nothing like a dictionary, because it's like we can't, because this is what I mean. Derrida comes along and he's like, oh, really? You think a word is found in like in a dictionary? Well, definitions have words in them, and then you define those and you define there, you get the difference, the endless deterrence, right? Well, yeah, but look how Plato, in a sense, defined words. It's not by a dictionary. It's by an exploration, a certain orbiting, right? And the defining is more of it's more like you observe words versus define words, in a sense. Like obviously you have to have definitions, but as we talked about in our talk, Jockin, the definition must always be held loosely for the definitive. You know, you hold the definition is not the definitive. What you could say happened in some thinking is that the definition is the definitive, or the definition has nothing to do with the definitive, versus it be the space of the wayfaring, the space of the daydreaming. Like, okay, well, let's try to define justice and create in that a space of daydreaming that then changes the relation to time, because it will forever change how we carry the word justice with us or how we exploit it. So in the same way that D.C. Schindler talks about beauty as gathering, it's funny to look at the effort to define words per se in Plato's dialogues as a gathering under a term versus trying to find the different definition in a dictionary in different things. Now, obviously, when Derrida gets into Cora and space within space, he has a sense of this, so I'm not bashing Derrida, but a lot of the understanding that is taught of language is simply its impossibility. Well, its impossibility in space may mean that words have something to do with a relation of time, therefore a gathering under this orbiting and consideration. So I like what you were saying. The other thing I would say, and then I'll pass it to Javier and Philip, is I think one day self-help books, you know how now it's like, well, if you really want to understand, like Samuel Lunkar has a tremendous lecture on being in time, where he says, well, you have to go to the day and age that Heidegger is writing in to understand that being probably should be existence in time, not being in time. I think one day we'll do that with self-help books. We'll be like, well, in the age of self-help, when this was written, say in the 70s, the context was not email, and they really couldn't co-opt this self-help to make you always exhausted and always on the cell phone, right? Like there's a certain historical embeddedness to a lot of the self-help advice that is actually extremely good. But you have to realize that, well, wait, we're in a socioeconomic condition maybe of the white-collar job where they know about these self-help books, and now this doesn't get you ahead. It's what is expected of you to just keep the job, and it becomes a race to the top now, right? That's the problem of, like, once people know about this stuff and it is the culture, it then becomes the culture versus a way to actually transcend the culture. Because a lot of times when these self-help books are written, it's a way of how to be distinct from, say, the work culture. Mr. Jockin, please.
I'm sorry to jump in, but just on that one particular point, but we say that, but yet could we not agree that most subjects are incredibly self-centered? And I say that because one of the most powerful things about Seven Habits, especially the later half, is the idea of seeking first to understand, then to be understood, find win-wins, and synergy, right? Those are clearly other-centric. It's an ethics of other-centric that is, in a way, the beautiful. Like, I would make an argument that what Covey's getting at, he can't get there because he doesn't have the language to pull it off. And nor is that really relevant in that context. But he absolutely makes comments that I would say is clearly showing a kind of ethics of the beautiful being drawn out. So I would say most people are not operating that way. In fact, optimization actually denies that possibility. ironically. I mean, I made my stance. I don't want to jump in, just say it.
Oh no, and there is absolutely, like, when you look at A Whole New Mind of a Pink or Norman Peele's Positive Thinking, there are parts of that that are completely missed that moves you out of the egotistic getting ahead. We tend to piecemeal it. Just like we tend to do with philosophy, we tend to piecemeal the parts of philosophy and the academia that's in service of the pre-existing agenda. So can happen with the self-help books. And it's just very interesting to me because what ends up happening is the self-help culture of today tends to be a reflection of piecemealing these original texts. Like Norman Peele, and there's the other guy that escapes me, I'll remember in a minute, who I really do like, where it's this piecemealing of different things that makes a culture of self-help that seems different in the same way that academic philosophy seems different than philosophy. There's a kind of piecemealed self-help that is separated from the original texts that tend to be quite problematic, right? Yeah, like if you go back to, gosh, I can't, he's one of my favorite, someone like a Napoleon Hill or something like that, right? There's a lot of great stuff in Napoleon Hill. What you hear is the paraphrased versions of Napoleon Hill that are used in Billard Bolds, and then kind of talking about all of these different things that are then used by the boss as an expectation on people, right? In the same way that the philosophical academia could be like, oh, you've got to read this book and this book and this book if you're going to be a serious philosopher. And then we listen to Mr. Sadler, he's like, no, that's not how it works. That's not really how it works. You kind of you get into philosophy wherever you enter and you let the wonder take you, right? So it's just interesting because I wonder, it's just kind of a thought. I wonder if the self-help book, but if you think about it, kind of has some philosophical, like if you look at a Napoleon Hill, it's kind of a philosophical kind of thing, not Aristotle, but it has philosophical interest. It's almost like the self-help book in the same way that you have scholars to get back to the original context of the City of God or Confessions and the economic situation. And we really have to understand this philosophy in this day and age. Otherwise, we misunderstand it. It's funny to think if sometimes something similar occurs with the self-help books. Certainly the older ones. Now, I'm not a big fan of the nonfiction New York Times bestseller list because they all have the same structure now. You read the chapter, the end, the middle case, all case studies, they end around page 250 because the numbers show that's what's the highest publication. And they tend to have one really good idea that they find a bunch of they have one good idea, they then find a lot of case studies for, and that's it. And I have some criticisms of that. But it is interesting where you get into these older books that were self-help before self-help was a genre often, that they actually have substance that should be taken seriously. So your point is well taken. So I was just thinking of that as you were speaking, but I definitely think that there is something to be said about today with the collapse of space, the primacy of the relation of time emerges. And what's interesting to me is language is almost the furniture of our relation of time. The way we relate to time seems profoundly impacted by language. Like language is the thing you carry into all spaces. It's kind of the way that you undergo time. Whereas in space, it's furniture, bookshelf, desk, right? Language seems to be very temporal in an interesting way, which then of course makes sense, where if language is not so much definitions, which seems very spatial, like, oh, it fits in the space, this is the space, rather it is this gathering thing. Okay, what is that? What are these terms? It's gathering. It seems like language then does have a more temporal sort of orientation. It's gathering you through time. It's organizing your unfolding of time. And that's where then, therefore, thinking of the difference between labor, work, action, doing nothing, boredom, daydreaming, these are precisely the conditioning of our relation to time and the way that we gather our time, and we're gathered by time and different things. And then the last thing I was saying is just a quick note. I find it interesting, like happiness seems like when someone is happy, you feel the happiness, like empathetic, like the field stuff, sadness. Does that happen with boredom? I don't recall, like if someone's bored, I feel bored because they're bored. Whereas if you encounter someone that's sad that you feel sad, there's something interesting there. I wonder if like boredom doesn't have the same field effect, empathy, the same thing as seemingly other emotions. Like other emotions seem easier to catch than boredom, no binding quilting. And then boredom then is like on the road to hell or something in this negative way that we're describing. But then, Jesus descends into hell in the Christian story, and that's part of the resurrection. Boredom could be the road to, heaven, right? It takes you out into the realm of action. But those are thoughts. Well, let me give it to Javier and Philip. Mr. Javier Rivera.
Okay. I mean, I agree with Jockin's idea of other engendering. But you could say the problem that happens with the other engendering is that most people mistake other engendering as objects. You get the people that are open-minded, they care about people, but then they can't handle people that are closed and so on. And so there's a kind of irony between a lack of, what I'm trying to say is the under engendering doesn't answer all of it. It's definitely helpful, but it doesn't. It has the possibility of regressing. The thing that I would say, and here's the question I want to put, is that I think, for example, when we're talking about self-help books and discipline, to me, I think it's hard to distinguish when we're at the end of a repetition, that we are now creatively looking for options to do something, versus somebody that has already preemptively interrupted the repetition to then engage in self-help, which to me, I think actually makes sense because, and would be very hard to tell the difference, because some people will be like, well, it just takes discipline. But to me is like, does it? Meaning like, is it the fact that you already reached an end of a repetition that you discovered that you wanted to do something, and then you decide to wake up in the morning? Or is it the fact that you're coping and disrupting a repetition to reaching its end, to where now you're struggling to wake up in the morning because you want to wake up in the morning because you heard it's good, but you can't. And so now you're discovering whether it's a question of willpower or not, and your lack of discipline, and then guilt, etc., etc. So I guess my question is that it's very hard to determine at what point in the unfolding have you completed your repetition to decide to discover a creative option to pursue something like self-help, or where you are interrupting actually the unfolding of an end that needs to be met in order to actually do the creative option making. And I would bet anything the reason why self-help is the way that it is precisely because people are interrupting themselves repetitively, to where self-help actually has this really ironic irony where it doesn't matter how much self-help books you read, you're still not fully satisfied. Right? I think it's more the sort of speed and repetition at which someone keeps interrupting an unfolding. I guess you could say this is similar to what Jockin was talking about. Painful doesn't mean it's bad. Okay? And I can actually give a real example of how repetition just plays out. I mean, you saw this, Daniel, in my video with Chetan, where I said that for a long time, I hated myself for being a short form writer, and that was really painful for me because I really wanted to be like a long form writer, and I thought it really was a question of discipline. But then after repetitively having a beef and gripe with my short form writing, something happened. Something happened, right? It suddenly changed. And you could say this was just after repeatedly continuing to write that I started enjoying my short form writing. And actually now it's painful for me to do longer writing. It's actually painful for me to do longer writing now. And I enjoy it, and it gives me a deep fulfillment. And then, of course, I have to wonder when that will end and reach its fulfillment, and something else will pop up for me. So, yeah, I think, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Excellent. I'll give it to Philip. Before I forget, I also think so. One, I should note that there is this white collar first kind of read all the self-help non-fiction like books like that. So, there's some kind of problems with that. And then again, like I said, there's books like I feel like Drive by Daniel Pink, which talks about intrinsic motivation. That was very influential on me in a good way. But a profound, also I should note, I feel like sometimes self-help books are trying to race in and fill the void left by the loss of elders. Like elders used to be the source of kind of self-help, right? But they didn't call it self-help. It was called wisdom. So it's like we don't have elders, or we don't even know what wisdom is because you don't have a culture for it. So there's a way in which self-help is kind of filling that loss, if you will, right? And of course, it has to have some good in it. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't spread, right? It has to have some. But there's something about for me, self-help, my self-help came from sitting on the porch with my grandfather or visiting Mr. Dillard or Mr. Chapman, like stuff like that. That was the main self-help, if you will, and I didn't even think of it as self-help. To your question, I think basically the metric for me is self-forgetfulness. Like, so for example, what do I need to do to not think about myself and just do the thing? Because the moment I start asking, oh, should I have this job or not? I probably need to go because I don't have self-forgetfulness. Like, so for example, when I was at the wholesale, like when I had a job unloading trucks for a long time, I did that for like 7 or so years and just did it. Didn't even think about it. But then the day came where it's like, oh, I need to do this to get ahead. I was thinking about doing it to the point where it's just thinking about how to optimize or not to do it or whatever. The very act of it becoming visible in that sense was evidence that actually it needed to go away. And it wasn't the same as thinking like, what do I need to do to unload the truck? It had this different quality of thinking about the job. It wasn't the doing the things of the job. It became the job itself gained this sort of thought about it, like the broken doorknob in Heidegger, if you will. Like likewise, when I'm writing a paper, like I just actually, just as a story, I just finished a paper that I started in 2015 called Incentives to Problem Solve that I started. I got to the point where I was thinking about it a lot. And so I put it away and then 10 years, I found myself writing it in a self-forgetful state versus a state of thinking about it constantly. And that's how I kind of think about things. The moment you move between the things in terms of the self-forgetful, or else you're asking questions of, is this useful? Is this good? Is this useless? And you're in a one-sidedness now. You're going back and forth, and that's when you get paralyzed. So for me, the optimization of self-forgetfulness, which in a sense means you forget about optimization, becomes everything. So for example, because there's a great question on, okay, well, do you value your sleep or getting up early more? Because you have to make some sort of value assessment in that choice. The way I think about it is the following. Okay, if I don't get enough sleep, then even if I get up early, the whole time I'm groggy and thinking about how I'm tired. Therefore, I don't have self-forgetfulness. So I need to go to bed early so that when I wake up early, I have all of the effect I had and I'm self-forgetful. So the main thing you're valuing is the self-forgetfulness, that then you think about the strategy or the conditioning of the getting up early and sleeping in a manner to do these things, right? Likewise, you say, okay, well, I value the self-forgetfulness, which to me is the state of organization toward the beautiful and the lack and the flow and all these things, right? So you go, okay, philosophy matters, but then if I become too aware of philosophy, it's taking me out of life. And if I'm out of life, that's a problem. So how do I do philosophy in a manner that keeps me philosophy forgetful? Mr. Jockin, good to see you. And I have to run in a moment as well. How do I how does life not become something I optimize? How do I maintain a certain self-forgetfulness with it? Well, actually, I find if I don't do philosophy, I'm always confused. So I need to do philosophy to be self-forgetful, but not do it in an academic setting because then it becomes my identity and I think about philosophy too much. So I need to do philosophy in a non-academic setting that is mostly in the morning and mostly conversational with other non-professional academic philosophers who don't define themselves primarily as philosophers, thus keeping it in the suboptimal, all of which makes it easy not to take philosophy too seriously because we're all just a bunch of crazy people here, but not taking philosophy not seriously enough that then when you go through life, you're constantly in drama and problems because you don't know how to condition yourself toward life in a manner that has self-forgetfulness, if you will. So the thing I personally always, basically, I constantly make decisions according to what creates self-forgetfulness. Like when I write a paper, if I'm thinking the whole time about the paper should have a flow, I should have read enough books to the point, had the daydreaming ideas that when I get there, it just happens. And if it doesn't, then I'm going to leave it on my computer for 10 years. And maybe I never come back to it. Well, if I never come back to it, then great. Who am I to think this paper is that much valuable, right? Like, who am I to think this is a good idea? Well, obviously not, if you weren't able to self-forgetful in it, right? So there's a kind of testing that emerges, but the testing is naturally secondary from the self-forgetfulness, not an effort of optimization. That's what I find. Like you say, I want to optimize my paper writing. That seems to be a problem. You need to optimize your self-forgetfulness, and from that, secondarily, other things come. That's how I think about it, because otherwise I find myself perpetually in one-sidedness. I'm thinking too much in terms of use, or I'm thinking too much of uselessness. This is gamified into use, as Chetan was saying, y'all were talking about. Or if I think about beauty, the problem is if you treat beauty this way, then it just becomes pretty. It's not beauty is then a thing that you're optimizing to that then also is just in the realm of utility, right? beauty has to be a product of self-forgetfulness. Otherwise, it's a product of calculation. And if it's a product of calculation, then what you're calling beautiful doesn't have the surprise of beautiful, right? It doesn't have the effect on the subjectivity. So I think a lot in terms of self-forgetfulness. And then for me, the repetition. Basically, you're interrupting the repetition. If you are still self-forgetful, then you would be interrupting the repetition to change it. And do you know what I think the main reason people interrupt repetitions that are self-forgetful is? Fear, judgments from other people, people saying you're wasting your potential. You actually know that you're forgetful in this state. Fear is the biggest threat to a repetition you shouldn't stop. The repetition you should stop is the one where without external fear or external concerns, you find yourself losing self-awareness in. So if you have a repetition and you're losing if you're losing self-forgetful in that repetition, it's time to change it. But if the thing is not losing self-forgetfulness and you're thinking about interrupting it, it's almost always an act of fear. And the one who fears is not made perfect in love. But let me give it to Philip here. Philip, please.
Yeah, and fear often comes from a lack of generational wealth. Daniel, I have a question for you. Since you are someone who is so pro-test, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but there's a lot of this going on this week, and I wonder what your thoughts on the form and content of the college protests are.
Oh, no, that's a wonderful question. For me, I think looking at the sociologists like, James Hunter, Peter Berger, we use the phrase conditions of possibility and faithful presence. Generally speaking, protesting, let's take the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King. Protesting tends to require someone like a Thurgood Marshall in the Supreme Court of whom you can stimulate. So you have to have people in positions of power that the protesting can stimulate or get the public sees the protesting and then someone in a position of power changes things. And because the protesting occurred where they saw the videos like in Selma, where Martin Luther King's talking about the TV, right, where they see the violence, that makes people more accepting of the change that happens from the Supreme Court, right? Where then they're not trying to overturn it, but you have to have this double move that is occurring where the protesting has to be in service of people who are faithfully present in positions of power. Also, the protesting is very important that it not be done in a manner that can rationalize being against the protesters. This is when you're non-violently resisting and an officer hits you in the face, it is very difficult to rationalize that the protester is innocent because it reflects on you existentially. Like that guy didn't put up a fight and the officer attacked him. Wow, maybe I am in a wrong, because it does a kind of existential reflection on yourself, right? But if the protester fights back and gets hit by the officer, then the people who are probably not in favor of what the people are protesting anyway, they're more likely to say, yeah, well, it was self-defense. So protesting has to have a faithful presence in positions of power, and it cannot allow existential rationalization, right? And that's where nonviolent resistance occurs. In those conditions, protesting can make a difference. Otherwise, it does not tend to be effective because it is absorbed by the capital nation state, as Karatani talks about. Now, there is an argument to be made that because Biden's presidency is so dependent on the younger vote, that it might actually have an impact on his armament of Israel, because he could lose the younger vote, and that's a major concern of his, because if you get more and more people that are not going to vote for Biden, that could be a problem. But that would only work because then the protesting is linking with someone who has a position of power and there's skin in the game. There has to be skin in the game. So let me put it this way. Protesting has to be part of a faithful presence that changes the conditions of possibility. And in order to do that, it has to make people who see the protesting reflect on themselves emotionally to see that, oh, maybe I shouldn't support this policy because those people are just innocently protesting and the officers are attacking them, or things like that.
I wonder, like, if on some level, because this seems, all right, it's a nation state thing, it's a post-World War II thing, it's even way before that, it's a religion thing, and it makes me wonder if on some level, in order to affect any kind of material change, if you have to take a religious standpoint, even if you are saying after this, I want us all to be philosophical thinkers, rather than that side bad, this side good, in the story, now we make the change, and then we go, reintegration.
The notion of the moral real that you're saying, like something's going to happen. The moral real, there's an October 7th, there's a lot of violence, what are we going to do? This is why decentralization is not enough. Like when there's a lot of talk today, if we only decentralized, then everything would be good, right? If we had different nations, there would be no capital nation state. But here's the issue. Like, as long as there are different civilizations that are doing different things in a telecommunication world that other nations can see what those other nations are doing and thus feel existentially pinned down to respond or say something, this will always destabilize the decentralization. Now, decentralization, let me clarify, decentralization is absolutely part of the puzzle. But you will not solve everything with decentralization because of the moral real. A great example, there are many, many people who feel like eating meat is a deeply immoral thing, you know, deeply immoral. All right, well, you have some civilizations that eat meat, others do not. How do they get along? Do they interact? Do they demonize the other? Do they completely separate? These are things that are going to be real. You have one decentralized community that doesn't believe it's wrong to use fossil fuels. Another thinks it does. What's going to happen? Does that transition to rhetoric, debate, or military? You know, basically, if you don't believe in the possibility of philosophy, when you have moral disagreements, there's no possibility of speaking them out, and then it's going to fall back onto conflict or atomization. Please.
Well, and I think that that brings up what Schmachtenberger said, the answer to all the problems is all the solutions. And that just takes so much pleasure and honestly caring about it. But even to get to a point where I think it was Marcuse who talked about repressive tolerance.
Yeah, Marcuse.
So it's we may want to be intolerant about certain things at certain times, and it's I don't know, it's just.
But the moment you say that, there has to then be a way to mediate those differences. Because some people may agree that we shouldn't tolerate this, other people may disagree, bam, then you get the conflict.
Well, that's where some, and I don't know, you can't force this, but some Hegelian indifference can help us live indifference.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what I'm saying? Where it's just hey, this thing bothers me a lot, but this person, I don't know, dresses this way. And it's just can you find a way to have that bother you less?
Yep. Yeah.
Because what are the other options? You have dress codes or something like that. I mean, it's kind of. I wonder how the next 5-10 years will play out in the sort of both individual and collective tension between what do we tolerate and what are we intolerant of, because that's one of the seeds I see with the protest is that they're we are intolerant about the allocation of certain resources.
Mm-hmm.
This is not okay. This almost, I know it's not a 1-to-1, but it feels sometimes like a taxation without representation. They're we don't want the monies to go there. And they're cool, you don't have any say where the money's going. And it's well, that seems to be problematic, but just to cut the monies off also doesn't seem like the play either. So
No, that's exactly right. And to me, it's all the indifference things you're saying is exactly right. There's something to be said about indifference. But what if you're indifferent about a moral atrocity? And that becomes in the grand technology, it's in a globalized world where you have digital technology and you know about so many atrocities, then indifference seems like a terrible thing. But then again, it might be a non-rational necessity in a game theory dynamic where if everyone is concerned about everyone else's business in manners that are ignorant of the geopolitical realities and they don't even have skin in the game anyway, is that going to give us good policy? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So is there a way in which indifference is the necessity of a Nash equilibrium to keep it from exploding into something? Well, these are terrifying realities and we don't like looking at it. It's very dark, possibly, right? And you're looking at the human in a dark way. And what do you do with that, right? And that's very hard. And yes, I mean, but to me, the reason, let me put it this way, the moral real, so the problem of scale and the moral real, these are the problems. And you cannot deal with it simply by a new form of government. You say, well, we're going to decentralize. We're going to decentralize because you say, and you're right, a lot of people, they have a fair point. They're I'm putting tax money towards something I don't believe, and I don't like that. All right, that's fair, but you're also using roads, right? You're using infrastructure that are provided by the taxes. So the argument is well, you don't get a say on this if you get that, right? You see how it all explodes, right? So you say, well, fine, I'm just going to separate from society. I'm going to atomize. I'm going to be Amish. Well, people can do that, but this is why belonging again is obsessed with these questions, right? Where you kind of separate apart. The moral real is not addressed by decentralization. But the point is that decentralization may help you avoid a lack of representation or taxation problems, but the moral real will still be there and it will pop up. And in a globalized world with information technologies, you know about it. You can't plead ignorant. And what's your position? Are you going to, you're not going to support Israel? You're going to support Israel? And people know what you're doing, right? Like you feel like you have to decide. And if you don't take a position, you're a bad person. But then who are you to take a position on something that you're not involved in and not a world expert on? And then there's an existential terror that sort of comes in. And the paper, not that I'm telling you to read it, it's in Second Thoughts, the one where it's called The Grand Technology, that tries to bring together the brothers Karamazov, Paul Virilio, the Eye in the Sky movie, because I think that's a very good movie about the kind of train technology and different things, all come together. But let me pass it to Sam. Miss Willem, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say, like, maybe to bring it back to what we had talked about earlier, it's like, rather than being disinterested, like there's many ways to do nothing. Rather than being disinterested, like you can, like a farmer would labor at a atrocity by sending food and aid. A politician would work on an atrocity by creating diplomacy, like engaging in diplomacy, making a law, maybe waging a war. But like, I feel like there's a sense in which, and I think Hannah in other texts, she talks about like a fundamental gratitude, even towards things like atrocities. And it's like the mystic can act upon atrocity by being grateful for it, by forgiving, like, and I think that's kind of like something that is a taboo thing to say in in general discourse.
Oh no, I think that's an excellent comment, Sam. And for me, basically, we talked about the freeing of speech, Zoom technologies. I would very much like if it was a central part of education where you regularly have Zoom technology or conversation with the other, the radical difference to humanize them. Because when that occurs, like I'm very interested in the history of diplomacy. Say like we were talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis between Kennedy and Khrushchev, where you go through, or even you're talking about like Kissinger and Mao, or the willingness of people to open a line of communication with the other has incredible consequences policy-wise, lowering, see you, Mr. Rivera. Thank you for being here, sir. The likelihood of humanizing, of avoiding violence, conflict, and different things like that really go through the roof. When nations cut off lines of communication, they don't talk with one another, the likelihood of something exploding is very, very high, at which point it becomes incredibly difficult by which to avoid this. So for me, since I am not a policymaker, the kind of philosophical, you want to increase the amount of freeing speech using these technologies as possible, which is an act of action, that then like, oh, we're doing nothing, we're just talking. Well, if American students are talking with Chinese, Palestinians, Israeli, Russian, all of these different things, and there's a mass humanization that occurs, then when moral differences arise, there has been a prior humanization that allows the possibility of discussion or arriving at policy that is not going to lead to unintentional consequences that can be very dire. So we haven't done the work prior to these moral real situations of humanizing people because we haven't had the infrastructure. But in human history, you can say the infrastructure simply was not there. Well, now it is there. It's possibly there. And so I would be much in favor of that. But well, I've appreciated speaking with everyone. Thank you all for being here. Christian, Sam, Philip, thank you all for hanging around. I appreciate it very much. And I really like the discussion. Philip, good to see you, sir. Thank you very much. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. All the best to you. Thank you, Sam. Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good one. Bye, Christian.